1965, Bob Dylan divided the world into the hip and the unhip. And in 1979, he divided the world into the saved and the damned. That's it. That's the only difference.
It isn't straight biblical tub thumping, and it's not straight celebratory gospel either. He put it through that strange prism of looking at the world in Dylan's way, and you know, suddenly it was 1965 again in a sense. The old Dylan reappeared, the old zealous Dylan.
Was this period of time a time of his being kind of out of gas, so to speak? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, music of the 80s, as we look back on, I mean, all the machines and the early techno stuff, I think, certainly made him look a lot older than he may have been.
The mid-'80s, you know, were not a good period for somebody like Bob Dylan. You know, he's kind of a roots musician, and how exactly you make a record like that in the mid-'80s, I think, was confounding. And I think it affected his ability to write songs and even write lyrics.
During the mid-1970s, Bob Dylan had seen his career revitalized after a lengthy period in the wilderness. His releases in the early part of the decade had confused his fan base and been treated harshly by critics, all of whom were hoping for a return to the phenomenal form that had produced the 60s classics Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde. Yet it was the breaking down of his marriage in 1974 that eventually led to Blood on the Tracks, a release filled with heartbreak and anger that nevertheless was hailed by many as a masterpiece on its release and proved to be the record that everyone had been waiting for. Dylan followed this with not only another well-received album, Desire, but also returned to the road with an all-star entourage for the celebrated Rolling Thunder Revue. Yet this adulation from the music press was not to last, and both the feature film Ronaldo and Clara and his follow-up album Street Legal were heavily criticized. In 1978, he embarked upon another tour, and although during its European leg it was roundly applauded, on his return to the US, the 3-hour concerts were savaged by the critics.
The critics and the reviewers really did seem to, you know, have their teeth into Dylan. Ronaldo and Clara had been a big flop, Street Legal had not done well, and they all decided, as one it would appear, to give the uppity man from Hibbing a good kicking, metaphorically. And that certainly, Dylan found very disappointing, you know. But he did a lot of interviews at the time to try and correct that impression, and he did work at it. But obviously, towards the end of the tour, he's struggling to keep spirits up. And of course, as we now know, one night in November, you know, when his spirits were low, he had a vision of King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Everything changed. He became literally born again.
He's a paradox in that he is a deeply private person, but he's also on the stage so many times during the year. And I think when he had that experience, it was this personal experience somehow that Jesus came to him, and it was a real, as he put it a couple years later in an interview, that it was Jesus became real to him, and it was just this experience. So I don't think, like I don't think it was that he converted from so-called Judaism to Christianity, even though there's certainly, you can't ignore the Judeo-Christian factor there. I think it was just one of these experiences that was deeply personal for him.
However personal Dylan's epiphany may have been, its ramifications were aggressively public. During the final leg of his world tour, Dylan occupied himself with writing new material around a radically different message from that which his flock were used to. As the tour concluded on stage in Miami, those in attendance were treated to a performance of a new composition, Do Right to Me, Baby, Do Unto Others, and a lyric steeped in biblical reference. The performance represented a preview of what was to come. After winding up the tour, Dylan retreated to Southern California, where he further pursued his religious conversion, spending early 1979 studying the Bible at New Age evangelical church, the Vineyard Fellowship, before assembling musicians to begin recording what would become the first in a trilogy of explicitly Christian albums. He recruited both guitarist Mark Knopfler and drummer Pick Withers from the young British rock outfit Dire Straits, and approached pioneering R&B producer Jerry Wexler to mix the record. In April of '79, at studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, work began in earnest on Dylan's last album of the decade, and the first of a new era, Slow Train Coming.
Well, I think Dylan decided to get Jerry Wexler, partly, I suppose, because of Jerry Wexler's background, and it would obviously produce a more smooth record. Obviously, the key role that Jerry Wexler, along with Barry Beckett, it must be said as well, of course, as a co-producer, was that Jerry Wexler had, of course, produced the Drifters, Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin. He had that whole Muscle Shoals thing down. So, you know, already it was looking like it was going to be quite a professional production.
It's tight in a way that many of his records are not tight. Now, one of the great things about Dylan is that he goes for loose. Tight is not what he cares about. And that's been an extremely effective musical strategy for him, because it's one of the ways in which he's kept his spontaneity intact, which has always, it seems to me, been his prime focus as an artist, to keep it spontaneous, keep it fresh. So Slow Train Coming both benefits from Wexler and Beckett, but on the other hand, it's not quite as spontaneous.
Yet despite the new, more disciplined production and arrangement, it was neither the musicianship nor the sound of the record that was scrutinized by the majority of its listeners upon its release in August 1979.